Welcome everyone, Christine here with the discussion about Nurgle in Total War Warhammer 3, Immortal Empires, and Realms of Chaos, if anyone still cares about Realms of Chaos. I've said it before and I'll say again, I think Creative Assembly should completely abandon Realms of Chaos. There's absolutely no reason to bother with Realms of Chaos. Yes, I understand that turn timers and the map lags in Immortal Empires, but the campaign in ROC is just awful. You're not playing a real campaign there. The map design, the faction design of factions on that particular map just isn't that great. But let's talk about Nurgle. And obviously with Nurgle you have to associate them with Kugath. Just to mention what the problem is in Kugath's campaign, his campaign has one of the worst starting positions for any particular Legendary Lord. In the sense of the Legendary Lord versus the start position. See, Kugath could work a lot better in a different starting position, but the fact he starts on Dragon Isle in territory isles in territory where he can't spread his plagues easily, where he's dealing with a lot of factions that hate him, that are also more powerful than him, like Gorst, Cafe, Emmerich, all of them capable of dealing with him. Hell, even Greases, let alone Grimgor, who actually shatters even some of the most powerful Legendary Lords in the game. The fact you start in such a position and you have to expand over here, because Gorst is going to declare war on you, and he's likely going to take most, if not all, of Noblar country. Now, for here, I was able to take the fight to Gorst and prevent him from wiping out the Skaven there, and then I made the mistake of allying the Skaven, which I shouldn't have, because other factions hate Skaven, and they declared war on them, and I got sucked into it. Broke the alliance with them, either way. But Kugath certainly has a lot of issues, but the biggest issue he has is that his race just honestly sucks. Let's go over why this is. Unit recruitment is a major issue in a campaign as Kugath. Like, let's say we want to recruit some units. Well, it's actually going to be a lot harder than you might think. The reason it's going to be a lot harder is the way unit recruitment works for Nurgle. So you need to build a military build a military building, but then you have to wait until they get to add this to the summon pool of units that Nurgle can then recruit. So there is this cycle that buildings do have, and they're going to add units to the summon pool, and that's how you recruit units. You can cheese it with Nurglings, because there is a way to get a lot of Nurglings in a particular campaign with a plague. There is a plague that does give you Nurglings if it spreads, so you can get a bunch of Nurglings in your campaign. But Nurglings are pretty awful, honestly. They have low leadership, low armor, not great stats. Like, they're basically like goblins in a campaign. They're cheap, to be fair, but they're not great units. There are some decent units in the Nurgle Demonic roster, but the problem is a lot of those units tend to be on the more expensive side. Like, consider the Plague Drones of Nurgle that he starts. Consider some of the Plague Drones he starts with, or some of the other units that you may start with in a Nurgle campaign, and the cost is pretty high. Demonic units in general are certainly on the more expensive side, and they're not, many times they're not necessarily worth the cost. This is certainly an issue with demonic units across the board in every single demonic campaign, because demonic races have weak economies, but the units they're using are quite a bit more expensive than that. So they're going to struggle with that. Furthermore, because you have this cycle for buildings, your economy is not stable, because the way it will work is that it's going to go from tier 1 to tier 2 to tier 3 to tier 4. Now, you can generate a good economy, a decent enough economy at a higher tier, but it will then, you will then have obviously issues when things go down. So you don't have a stable economy as Nurgle. Even if you're, and let's just ignore the fact that the campaign as Kugath is miserable to begin with, because you're having to deal with Gorst and other foes, but there's still plenty of problems. Economic instability is a major issue. Furthermore, on top of that, the buildings you're actually getting are incredibly expensive. Like, for instance, a basic military building is 5,000. Any of them are 5,000. An advanced military building is 10,000. An infrastructure building is 2,000. That's basically the costs of buildings that every other faction in the game, and even then, some of them will never pay in their campaign. So that's certainly a problem for Kugath. Because one, he already has a weak economy, he has an unstable economy, and he's having to pay a lot of money for those buildings. I think the cycle was perhaps a decent enough concept in theory, but I think it needs to be removed completely, at least for infrastructure buildings. Because you can't play a campaign if you can't rely on your economy. And thankfully, you don't have this bullshit for resource buildings or the main settlement buildings or ports, so there is some stability. But the fact that this applies to your quote-unquote main economic buildings, and obviously creates a lot of instability in your economy, and you're having to pay a lot of money just to get a pretty crappy building. Because consider this: let's say your like all your infrastructure buildings will generate the same kind of income. The difference is the secondary effect, be it growth control. So you're paying 2,000 for 50 income. That is genuinely the worst level of income that you can get in the game. Or 5,000 for 50, right? You're not getting buildings for the economy. You're getting it for the secondary effects. It's kind of like Skaven, but the thing is, the reason Skaven work is because Skaven have a building that buffs their economy in the entire province. You do not have such a building as Nurgle. And so you're constantly going to be dealing with you're going to struggle with even being able to recruit units in the first place in your campaign because of money. Even when you do recruit units, the army costs alone will bankrupt you. I mean, look at this army. It's not really an expensive army overall. Or it's not really an army of good high-tier units, but it's like completely draining my economy. It's turned 34, and all I can afford right now are 2 armies, and I'm at a major economic deficit right now because of these 2 armies. Sure, I could have filled them up with Nurglings as opposed to Forsaken of Nurgle and Marauders. I don't have I don't have Warriors of Chaos. Furthermore, it should be pointed out that your unit roster is pretty bad, unless you have the Champions of Chaos DLC. But if you have the Champions of Chaos DLC and you want to play Nurgle, why in the world would you play someone like Kugath or any other legendary lord that they can add for Nurgle as opposed to playing with Festus? Because Festus has the exact same unit roster, except he actually has easier access to it. He has a much better economy and just better mechanics overall in his campaign. And hilariously enough, he actually gets access to the plagues easier than Kugath does. So, because your plagues are tied to the research. And the research, by the way, the research tree is ridiculous. Like, you can see how little effort they put in this, because you get the research very early on for recruitment cost in regions with chaotic wasteland climates. Now, this makes sense for Realms of Chaos, given where you start. It doesn't make sense for Immortal Empires, given where you start. So that needs to change. In fact, the entire research tree, I would say, just offers you a bunch of meaningless crap. Like, oh, let's research. I mean, it's fast, don't get me wrong. A lot of the things you're getting are fast, but a lot of them just like feel really pointless to actually get. Like, look at the first meter. It's like, oh, 10 diplomatic relations with Khorne and Slaanesh factions. Armor and leadership for Nurglings all well and good, right? But it's like a 1% chance of plague spreading and the fever plague, which Festus can get access to without having to research it. So the entire race must be purged, I would say. Like, just completely thrown into the trash bin and purged. Because right now the limitations are too severe. And some people would say, well, it's fine if a race is slower. No, it's not fine. It's not fine because, to be quite blunt about it, the intern times are certainly long, and I'm not interested in playing a campaign, and I think I speak for a lot of people here. I'm not interested at all in whatever Kratos Assembly thinks we're going to do, where we spend 20, 30 turns doing fuck all in a campaign just to wait for our faction to grow so we can reach the point that other races, other factions, other legendary lords have from the very damn start of their campaign. Like, I understand that there's some people that play things slowly, but I think any person with experience is going to play a campaign much faster. And you know what? A lot of the legendary lords, if not the outright majority, if not the vast majority of legendary lords in the game, do work like that. You can make it work, even for weak races. If I'm playing the dwarves, I can certainly do a campaign fast in terms of number of turns, and I'm doing something every single turn. Or if I'm playing the Empire, for all the issues the Empire has. So I think designing a race that's just like really slow and ponderous on the campaign map is an awful design decision. But then again, this is Creative Assembly, who thought we would be okay spending 120 turns. Yes, that's how long. No, like 130 or so. 130 turns in the best case scenario to beat the Realms of Chaos campaign and save Versus. I've done that multiple times. It is an awful design decision. The long, ponderous campaigns, I mean, it can work. I'm not necessarily against a long campaign, but I want the campaign to feel good from the very first turn I pick it up, not for it to start getting better after I spend hours and hours in it. That's my perspective on that matter. So I think that's one of the things that they should have on the drawing board. That's like, how can we make this fun? How can we make this engaging? How do we make it so it's interesting? Not just like fixing economy or growth or anything like that. It's like, how do we make this engaging on the assumption that people don't want to waste their time, their lives, going through turn after turn? On top of that, Nurgle's auto-resolve is actually awful. Yes, I quite say that. It's so mind-blowing that you can't believe it when you say it, but consider this. Nurgle under Warriors of Chaos is genuinely one of the strongest. If actually, Nurgle is the strongest of the mono gods. Undivided is the strongest, of course, but individual gods, yes, Nurgle is the strongest. I mean, Valkia is better, sure, but that's more as a result of Valkia's effects as opposed to Khorne's effects. But god-wise, yes, Khorne is weaker than Nurgle. Nurgle actually has the best unit roster, especially when it comes to infantry, of the Warriors of Chaos. And yet playing Nurgle, the Daemonic Faction, is genuinely one of the worst choices you could have in a campaign. They need to improve that situation. Questine here, signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.